Well, even after issuing his very first presidential pardon, President Trump clearly does not know that the acceptance of a pardon is an admission of guilt. So by issuing a pardon on Friday night to former Sheriff Joe Arpaio, President Trump got Joe Arpaio to confess his guilt by accepting that pardon. 102 years ago, the United States Supreme Court said that a pardon, quote, carries an imputation of guilt and acceptance of a confession of it. So one thing that you don't hear from presidents who issue pardons is that the person pardoned did nothing wrong, because the person pardoned has just admitted guilt. But that's what President Trump seems to want us to believe about Joe Arpaio. In a brief press conference with the president of Finland today, President Trump offered a childish defense of his pardon of Joe Arpaio. The president didn't actually defend his pardon as much as he attacked what he said were the bad pardons issued by previous presidents, including some cases that were not pardons at all, but simply clemencies and reductions of sentences. But defending your actions by saying other people have done the same thing is not actually a defense of your actions, as you will discover the next time you're pulled over for driving through a stop sign, if you try that defense. And so the president criticized President Obama's granting of clemency to Chelsea Manning after Chelsea Manning had served 7 years in prison and had more years remaining on that sentence. The president specifically avoided any mention of President George W. Bush commuting the sentence of Scooter Libby, the aide to Vice President Cheney, who was convicted of perjury and obstruction of justice. President Bush deliberately refused to actually pardon Scooter Libby because he did not want to eliminate the finding of guilt against Libby, but he did want to eliminate the prison sentence. Now, why didn't President Trump mention President Bush's pardon of Scooter Libby on his list of bad presidential pardons issued by previous presidents? What could be more unpardonable than a president pardoning a member of his own administration? Well, first of all, as I said, President Bush did not actually pardon Scooter Libby. He simply eliminated Libby's prison sentence, which was only a 30-month prison sentence. But President Bush did not eliminate the $250,000 in fines that was part of Libby's sentence, and President Bush did not eliminate Libby's obligation to report to her probation officer for 2 years. And perhaps most importantly, President Bush allowed the legal process to come to a conclusion in the Libby case, including sentencing before the president took action. President Trump did something none of the presidents he mentioned today had done. He stepped into a case between conviction and sentencing and did not allow the case to come to a conclusion. So there might be a lot of reasons why President Trump did not mention President Bush commuting Scooter Libby's sentence today. Trump didn't want to attack a Republican. That's one reason. He obviously enjoyed attacking Presidents Obama and President Clinton. But President Trump does attack Republicans whenever he feels like it. And he certainly has attacked Republicans named Bush viciously. It seems the really big reason Donald Trump left George W. Bush and Scooter Libby out of his list of bad pardons and clemencies issued by previous presidents is that President Trump is saving that one. President Trump is saving the case of Scooter Libby for when he needs it, for when he pardons someone in his administration. If and when President Trump pardons members of his administration, including members of his family, that's when you're going to hear him talk about Scooter Libby. That's when you're going to hear him talk about the president pardoning a member of his administration. And Donald Trump will call it a pardon, what George W. Bush did, even though George W. Bush did not actually pardon Scooter Libby. Listen to what President Trump said today about President Obama commuting, not pardoning, Chelsea Manning.
President Obama commuted the sentence of Chelsea Manning, who leaked countless sensitive and classified documents to WikiLeaks, perhaps and others, but horrible, horrible thing that he did, commuted the sentence, and perhaps pardoned.
commuted the sentence, and then he looks up from his written script and says, perhaps pardoned. No, not perhaps pardoned. There was no pardon. President Obama did not pardon Chelsea Manning. But Donald Trump will say whatever he feels like saying if and when he pardons Mike Flynn or Paul Manafort or Jared Kushner or Donald Trump Jr. or Ivanka Trump. And one of the things he's absolutely going to say is that President Bush pardoned Scooter Libby. He's going to say that even though it's not true. The president provided no facts whatsoever to back up his pardon of Joe Arpaio. No facts, just adjectives. He simply said this.
Sheriff Joe is a patriot. Sheriff Joe loves our country. Sheriff Joe protected our borders. And Sheriff Joe was very unfairly treated by the Obama administration.
Okay, not just adjectives, but you know what I mean. No facts. President Joe Arpaio, called Sheriff Joe by President Trump. He's not a sheriff. He's a former sheriff who was defeated in his last re-election campaign. Joe Arpaio was not convicted by the Obama administration. Joe Arpaio was convicted by the Trump administration. Federal prosecutors working under Trump's Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, prosecuted the case against Arpaio, which is why President Trump tried to get Jeff Sessions to drop the case against Joe Arpaio. The Washington Post reports the president asked Attorney General Jeff Sessions whether it would be possible for the government to drop the criminal case against Arpaio, but was advised that would be inappropriate. And listen to this sourcing. According to 3 people with knowledge of the conversation. So let me guess, 3 people with knowledge of a conversation between the president and the attorney general. Well, it's a good thing that the president has never done anything or said anything to alienate Attorney General Jeff Sessions, so we know the leak couldn't possibly have come from Jeff Sessions' side of that conversation. It's worth noting that the Trump White House remains the leakiest White House in history, even with former General John Kelly as the new chief of staff, who was supposed to, among other things, stop the leaking. Todd Gilman, the Washington bureau chief of the Dallas Morning News, got the first question at the press conference today, and he went straight to recovery funding for Texas after the devastation of Hurricane Harvey.
You've also threatened a government shutdown potentially next month over border wall funding. Are these going to hamper long-term, the funding that will be needed long-term for recovery?
No, Todd. I think that you're going to see very rapid action from Congress, certainly from the president, and you're going to get your funding.
Does this situation make you reconsider the possibility of a government shutdown next
I think
month?
It has nothing. This is going to go really very, very quickly. Again, I've spoken to many of the people we're talking about, and everybody feels the same way I do.
Funding for hurricane recovery has everything to do with a government shutdown. It has everything to do with everything. Paul Ryan and other Republicans already said they weren't going to have a government shutdown over Donald Trump's border wall. And now a government shutdown would mean instantly cutting off aid to those people in Texas who the president claims to sympathize with. The possibility of a government shutdown now is less than zero. The president's staff will be explaining that to him if they haven't already, and the funding for hurricane recovery probably will not go very quickly or very smoothly. Most of the Texas congressional delegation, including both Texas Republican senators, voted against aid for the victims of Hurricane Sandy. They did that for 2 reasons. First, they are Republicans. And second, the victims were not in Texas. The victims of Hurricane Sandy were primarily in New Jersey and New York, and now the congressional delegation that voted against aid for the victims of Hurricane Sandy will be asking Congress for, what, $70 billion, $100 billion more for the victims of Hurricane Harvey? Paul Ryan knows that he needs to round up votes to raise the debt ceiling and to pass a budget, and so Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell might just decide to put all of those things together in one bill, which means it won't be quick, and a new budget for all of the government departments, a raise in the debt ceiling, and special funding for Hurricane Harvey relief. All of that in one piece of legislation. If Ryan and McConnell put all those things together in one bill, then senators like Ted Cruz would be forced to vote for that bill to get the Hurricane Harvey relief money that they want. Otherwise, it might be impossible to get senators like Ted Cruz to vote for an increase in the debt ceiling or to vote for the budget bill that the Republicans are going to have to pass and that they're going to have to develop in a compromise with Democrats. Now that the president can no longer threaten a government shutdown to pay for his wall, he is, in effect, writing a new chant for his supporters to use at his next rally.
Is your plan still to have Mexico pay for the wall?
Yes, it will. One way or the other, Mexico is going to pay for the wall. That's right. It may be through reimbursement, but one way or the other, Mexico will pay for the wall.
And so at the next Trump rally, I suppose we'll be hearing something like, and who's going to pay for the wall? Whereupon the audience will shout back, Mexico will reimburse us for the wall. Joining us now, Maria Teresa Kumar, President and CEO of Voto Latino, an MSNBC contributor. Also with us, Steve Bell, former Republican staff director of the Senate Budget Committee and a senior advisor at the Bipartisan Policy Center. And also joining us, Ron Klain, former chief of staff to Vice Presidents Biden and Gore and a former senior aide to President Obama. Maria Teresa, I want to go to you first on the pardon of Joe Arpaio and the way the president talks about Joe Arpaio, who, by accepting the pardon, has admitted guilt to what he was charged with, but he has a history of much more than what he was charged with, and that's a history that the president ignores.
Absolutely. Well, the DOJ had found that he basically had violated the Constitution under the Eighth Amendment for cruel and unusual punishment. This is a sheriff who prided himself on running his tent cities like concentration camps. The number of hangings that occurred in his camp with people under detention was unprecedented. He would shackle women while giving childbirth. I mean, it goes on. And the fact that the Maricopa County voters voted him out, they voted him out because they were tired of not only the fact that he was basically terrorizing a whole group of people based on the color of their skin, because it was willy-nilly. It was just this, it was the guise of immigration reform. But he was also costing the taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars trying to do these erroneous efforts while not pursuing true crimes. He had close to over 400 backlogs of sex crime investigations that were failed to go unnoticed, and many of them were children. So the list goes on. And this idea that he was doing his job, no, he wasn't. And what President Trump just did, he basically threw the book at the Constitution because he prevented the judicial branch of government, of checks and balances, to fully do their job.
And Ron Klain, this intervening between a verdict, basically, and sentencing is something we haven't seen before.
You're right, Lawrence. You mentioned that before, but it's an unprecedented intervention by a president in the judicial process for no reason other than the fact that he likes Joe Arpaio's politics. Joe Arpaio was a birther, and Trump tweeted gratitude for him for raising the false claim that President Obama wasn't born in this country. He is a racist. He's a white supremacist. And that's basically the case President Trump was making at this press conference today. He agrees with them. He thinks he's a good guy, and therefore he gave him a pardon. Well, he isn't a good guy. And, this was a series of constitutional violations the Justice Department began to document under President George W. Bush that were further investigated under President Obama. And as you said, were finally prosecuted under the Trump presidency. So there is no basis for this pardon. It was an extraordinary act. And there's just no justification for what the president did. And his statement today that he did it during the middle of a hurricane because he thought it would get better ratings on cable is either tortured or a lie, or really both.
And it goes without saying, literally goes without saying, that Joe Arpaio would never have been pardoned if he were not a Trump supporter. And that's just not mentioned very much in all of this because we take it so for granted that, of course, to get a pardon from Donald Trump, you would have to be a Trump supporter. And past presidents have always been very careful and afraid of being associated with pardoning people who were their supporters. They've done it, but it's not something that most presidents want to be caught doing. Steve Bell, to the president's notion that it's going to be very easy, very quick to get all of this hurricane funding lined up.
Oh, I think it's the same way he said that we were going to have a tax bill by August. Even earlier than that, we were going to have a great tax bill. But the fact of the matter is this. They don't have very much time, depending on how you want to count 12 to 17 days of congressional action before the 1st of October. They have a number of things they have to get done. The primary one is to increase the debt ceiling before early October. Probably have to do that in mid-September sometime. They don't have a budget, as you pointed out, for fiscal year 18, which starts on October 1st. And I think what they're going to have to do is look the president in the eyeball and say, now, wait a minute. You said you would not accept a spending bill that didn't fund the wall. Does that mean if we send you a spending bill, you will veto it despite the fact that the federal government's money and help is absolutely essential to the recovery to those people who are victims of Hurricane Harvey? And that's going to be an interesting question for the president about 30 days from now to have to consider.
And Ron, in the past, hurricane funding has taken sometimes several months for Congress to act on. It didn't used to be that way, but starting around 2005, there were some Republicans led by Mike Pence in the House of Representatives who started to say, look, if you're going to do disaster funding like this, you must make other cuts in the budget to make up for whatever money you're spending in disaster funding. Prior to that, it used to be understood to be an emergency and something that the government was just going to have to spring into action on without cutting out other spending.
Yeah, Lawrence, this is a great country, and people in this country want to help one another, and that crosses party lines and it crosses regional lines. But a few years ago, the Republicans decided to politicize that, and Mike Pence said we should cut Medicare, cut old senior citizens' health care and poor people's health care through Medicaid to pay for disaster relief, a ridiculous position. And now he's our vice president. We're going to see what he recommends. I think the key thing here is I think Donald Trump will pass the bar of tweeting about the storm and flying on Air Force One, but this is going to take weeks and months and years, long after his Twitter feed has moved on. And the test of presidential leadership in this kind of situation is, does he have the focus, the consistent focus to oversee and drive this recovery to its end? And I think that's where President Trump, sadly, will fail the test of leadership on Hurricane Harvey.
And Maria Teresa, to Ron's point, that it seems to me to be exactly why the very first question to the president today was about the long-term recovery plan for Hurricane Harvey. Not what are you going to do this week, next week, but the long-term plan. And any talk of government shutdown, anything like that, and feuding with members of Congress, as the questioner pointed out, jeopardizes that.
That's right. I mean, this president so far in the last 7 months, he's been shooting from the hip. And this requires someone who is disciplined, strategic, who's filling the jobs in those federal agencies that he is yet to completely do. And he can't propose the budget that he originally had, which was basically slashing the National Guard, slashing FEMA, slashing disaster. And this is actually a testament of why we actually need those programs. And we need the right type of civil servant in those positions, because we cannot calculate when the next natural disaster will take place. And he needs to be disciplined. So hopefully Kelly being in there will enable him to actually have some sort of discipline, but it's a hard shot.
Steve, having worked in the Senate on the Republican side of the budgeting process, you know how Mitch McConnell thinks about these things. Do you expect Leader McConnell to wrap all of the difficult issues up into one package so that it's one vote, essentially, on the debt ceiling, on the budget, and on hurricane relief?
You know, I think that's a real possibility. When you don't have enough time, the thing you have to do, and this sounds like Yogi Berra, is create more time. And they really do have the ability to do that. If they want to have a short-term continuing resolution for spending for the government, let's say through the end of December, and if they want to have a short-term debt extension to the end of December, then they can probably work out, and I think this is what Mr. McConnell would like to do, would be able to work out the funding for the government, the first part of the funding for what is going to be a very expensive Hurricane Harvey recovery, and very long, by the way, as you pointed out, and to get things like the National Defense Authorization Act passed and flood insurance reauthorized and things like that. So they need time, and my suspicion is that Leader McConnell, who cares about keeping the majority in the Senate above most anything else, I think he'll probably say, look, give us 90 days up here, Mr. President. Don't veto a bill that doesn't have funding for it, for the wall. And please, let's do this in a logical way. And I think there's a real possibility that he'll do that. Now, the question is this. will the president, who thought he got tricked earlier this year when he went ahead with the FY17 budget with no money for the wall, will he say, no, once shame on you, twice shame on me, and veto it, which would, of course, would be a catastrophic political mistake?
Well, we're going to find out. Steve Bell takes his position now beside Yogi Berra and the great quotes of our time. If you're running out of time, create more time. Maria Teresa Kumar, Ron Clay, and Steve Bell, thank you all for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Coming up, newly discovered emails connecting Donald Trump and the Trump campaign to Vladimir Putin, and those emails tell the story of how Ivanka Trump once got to sit in Vladimir Putin's chair in the Kremlin. And later, a former Republican senator is warning his party about who he calls, quote, the hateful man in the White House. Once again, very suspiciously, President Trump could not bring himself to say a single negative word about Russia today when he was asked a simple yes or no question, is Russia a security threat? The president obviously was afraid of saying yes or no.
Mr. Trump, would you consider Russia as a security threat? Thank you.
Well, I consider many countries as a security threat, unfortunately, when you look at what's going on in the world today.
Many countries. The Washington Post reports, quote, while Donald Trump was running for president in late 2015 and early 2016, his company was pursuing a plan to develop a massive Trump Tower in Moscow, according to several people familiar with the proposal and new records reviewed by Trump Organization lawyers. The New York Times reported more details of those emails today. Trump associate Felix Sater, who was born in Russia, wrote a series of emails to Mr. Trump's lawyer, Michael Cohen, in which he boasted about his ties to Mr. Putin and predicted that building a Trump Tower in Moscow would highlight Mr. Trump's savvy negotiating skills and be a political boon to his candidacy. Our boy can become president of the USA, and we can engineer it, Mr. Sater wrote in an email. I will get all of Putin's team to buy in on this. I will manage this process. In another email to Michael Cohen, Felix Sater wrote, I will get Putin on this program and we will get Donald elected. Felix Sater was hired by Donald Trump to broker real estate deals. The Times also reports Felix Sater helped arrange Ivanka Trump's 2006 trip to Moscow, and that he said, quote, I arranged for Ivanka to sit in Putin's private chair at his desk and office in the Kremlin. Joining us now, Stephen Harper. He's an attorney and author. He's an adjunct professor at Northwestern University and contributor to BillMoyers.com. He created the Trump-Russia timeline. Also with us tonight, Tim O'Brien, executive editor of Bloomberg View and author of Trump Nation, The Art of Being the Donald. And Steve, on the timeline, here we have what will be on your timeline, the entry of some new emails, this new email discovery that's now been published first by the Washington Post and then more details by the New York Times. And this is a very, very direct communication about getting Vladimir Putin himself involved in helping Donald Trump win this election.
It's certainly interesting, and the interesting thing about it to me is that it really fits into a broader narrative, I think. And this is one of those situations where, you know, you can analyze the event and the emails in a micro sense, and then when you take a step back and look at it in a macro way, and realize that what's really going on here is that while a man is running for the presidency of the United States, his company is simultaneously trying to enter into a business deal which is reported to be one of the largest real estate projects of its kind in the world. Pretty stunning stuff, I would think.
And Tim, I want to take a look at the sourcing for these emails in the New York Times article. It says, the Trump Organization on Monday turned over emails to the House Intelligence Committee, which is investigating Russian meddling in the presidential election and whether anyone in Mr. Trump's campaign was involved. Some of the emails were obtained by the Times. Now, Tim, there's a consistent pattern here that when the Trump lawyers find emails, as they do involving Jared Kushner and others, that they turn over to any of the investigators, whether it be the House, Senate, or the special prosecutor. Those emails are almost instantly revealed to the press. And it seems to me that what we have here are defense lawyers saying to their clients, look, these are going to become public. You don't want them to become public the day you're sitting there on the witness stand or, in a Senate hearing. You want them to become public now so that they are old news by the time you testify.
It's also every man for himself in this thing. And so you've got different members of the Trump organization with their own counsel figuring out how to save themselves, because what Mueller is doing and what the congressional investigators are doing is they're picking off the weak members of the pack at the back of the pack, and they're going to move up the food chain towards Donald Trump. That's the ultimate end game here. And what's interesting about the emails today, Lawrence, is that Felix Sater has had a relationship with Donald Trump going back to about 2002. He wasn't just a broker for the Trump organization. He was a principal at Bayrock. They developed the Trump Soho Hotel together. Felix Sater is a career criminal with organized crime ties, and the president maintained a relationship with him for over a decade and routinely said in public, I don't know him well, I'm distancing myself from him. And now with these emails today, you see, one, the president is not distant from Felix Sater, and in fact, Felix Sater is the point person on a deal the Trump organization is trying to do in Moscow. And it raises this quid pro quo issue that's going to be really, I think, central to the Mueller investigation, is going beyond just collusion in the election, is were there favors sought from the Kremlin in return for certain quid pro quos.
And Felix Sater kept in office in Trump Tower during some of this period where Donald Trump says, oh, I didn't see him very much. And Steve Harper, on this release of what is basically evidence in the case, could it be that some of the defense lawyers involved with some of the Trumps and Trump associates want this information to become public as a way of communicating to other possible defendants and other people involved in the case, so that they know what evidence the other side already has on them?
Perhaps. It's always hard to figure out the timing on these kinds of things. The one thing we know for sure is that they were under a deadline to produce this stuff. And these came out, as I understand it, at the very end of the trail. Some 20 or so thousand other documents had already been produced. The other thing, I would add two other data points to the ones that Tim suggested, which I think are exactly correct. Remember, there was that June 2016 meeting. Well, in July of 2016, according to an interview that Sater gave to Politico, he visited Trump Tower on what he said was confidential business, refusing to disclose what it was. And then in January, at the end of January 2017, Sater again, he's sort of like the Forrest Gump of this administration. Sater again then shows up, this time at the Lowe's Regency Hotel in Manhattan, with Michael Cohen and Artemenko, a pro-Putin Ukrainian, with a so-called peace plan, the essence of which would cede Crimea to Russia and lift the sanctions. It's a stunning. That's what I mean. If you sort of draw back and start connecting all of the Sater dots, Tim is exactly right. This isn't just about a couple of emails, which, frankly, to me, read rather screwily. It's a larger story.
Just a note to audience: if you are struggling at any point connecting these dots, there is Stephen Harper's timeline. You can find it at billmoyers.com. It's the timeline of all of this with all of these characters that we are all relying on every day as we research these stories. Stephen Harper and Tim O'Brien, thank you both for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Larry.
Coming up, House Intelligence Committee member Eric Swalwell will join us with his take on these latest developments in the Russia investigation and also North Korea's latest missile launch tonight. Here's what candidate Donald Trump said about Vladimir Putin in December 2015 at a time when Donald Trump was trying to convince the Russian government to allow him to build a Trump Tower in Moscow.
Putin comes out, he said, Donald Trump is brilliant, he's doing an amazing job, and he's leading the pack. Okay, that's nice. And she and my opponent said, oh, isn't that terrible that Putin said, Wouldn't it be nice if we could get along with the world? Wouldn't it be, seriously? No, wouldn't it be nice? I mean, they want me to refute his statement. How dare you say I'm brilliant? How dare? Who's going to do that?
Joining us now, Eric Swalwell, Democratic Congressman from California, a member of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. And Congressman Swalwell, those things that Donald Trump was saying during the campaign that sounded so strange then seem to make a lot more sense tonight as we stare at the details of the Trump Tower deal for Moscow.
They sure do. And good evening, Lawrence. I first just want to say thank you for mentioning the Harvey victims. My heart goes out to and beats with them. And in Congress, I pledge to do everything we can without confusion or offsets to provide relief. But these emails now with respect to Russia, they are just more bright lights in a ever-growing constellation of Russian contacts that this president had. And it makes a whole lot more sense as to why he was praising Vladimir Putin. It looks like it was all about the money. He was seeking to invest in Russia, and in their own way, we know Russia was investing in Donald Trump.
And still to this day can't bring himself to say a negative word about Russia or Vladimir Putin in any context, no matter how you shape the question.
That's right. And it's time for the president to come clean because we need to know what exactly is it that Russia has on Donald Trump and what exactly does Donald Trump intend to do in Russia. He said all along, Lawrence, no Russia, no collusion. And now we have found out there were a lot of Russian contacts. There were a lot of efforts to work with the Russians and receive information on Secretary Clinton. And now we know it's not just personal and political relationships. It was also financial dealings. And by the way, Lawrence, how many Americans alive today do you think have sat in the chair of Vladimir Putin? That shows you how close Donald Trump was to a president who ordered an attack on our country. And
Ivanka Trump got to do that thanks to the intercession of a career criminal, Felix Sater, an associate of Donald Trump's. Can you stay with us, Congressman? We need to squeeze in a quick break here, and we're going to come right back with Congressman Eric Swalwell. We'll be right back. Tonight, North Korea fired a mid-range ballistic missile over Japan. Officials said the missile passed through Japan's airspace and landed in the Pacific Ocean. Congressman Eric Swalwell is still with us. And Congressman, last week at that rally, Donald Trump said this. He said, Kim Jong-un, I believe he's starting to respect us. I respect that fact very much. So that looks like a presidential misreading of North Korea.
North Korea does not respect us, Lawrence. They're a menace, and they are testing an unfocused president. The best thing that this president can do is to stitch together our allies, continue to work with China, not try and solve this by tweet, and continue to go to the UN to put pressure every time that North Korea acts out this way. But right now, he is unfocused and leaves us and our allies in a much unsafer position today than we were even last week.
We'll have more on this missile story as it develops. Congressman Eric Swalwell, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Coming up, a Republican senator is warning his party, a message directly to his party about Donald Trump, saying Donald Trump is not a real Republican, and he says he calls Donald Trump a hateful man. That's coming up. Senator John Danforth graduated from Yale Law School and Yale Divinity School in the same year, and in that same year, he was admitted to the bar to practice law and ordained as a priest in the Episcopal Church. He eventually pursued a career in politics. He was elected to the United States Senate as a Republican from Missouri and later served as President George W. Bush's ambassador to the United Nations. In an op-ed for the Washington Post on Friday, Senator Danforth wrote, "To my fellow Republicans, we cannot allow Donald Trump to redefine the Republican Party. That is what he is doing as long as we give the impression by our silence that his words are our words and his actions are our actions. We cannot allow that impression to go unchallenged. Our party has been corrupted by this hateful man, and it is now in peril." Joining us now, John Danforth, former Republican senator from Missouri. He's the founder of the John C. Danforth Center. Senator, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Your warning to Republicans about silence, are you talking about the elected Republicans in Washington who have been largely silent in the face of President Trump?
I think it's harder for the people who are in elective politics than it is for those of us who are out. I do understand it's difficult for people who are running for office or think they will be running for office, but I'm really talking about all Republicans. I think it's very important for us to make it clear that we are not like Donald Trump. He's very different. He's a very divisive person, and the history of the Republican Party has been the party of the Union, the party of trying to keep America glued together. So it's a message for all Republicans and beyond that, really for all of us, that trying to keep the country glued together is a principal duty of all of us.
Well, most people in the country, according to polls, seem to agree with you on this. The president's job approval is at 35% with a 60% disapproval. But when we look at the Republican numbers inside that poll, it's a different story. 78% of Republicans approve of President Trump. 7% of Democrats approve of the president, 30% of independents. So, Senator, you've got a difficult case in persuading the 78% of Republicans who apparently in the polls are with Donald Trump.
Well, I think there can be any number of reasons for being with him. I mean, it could be that they don't like the policies of the Democrats, or they want some. I think a lot of people want somebody that they perceive as being a strong person, and that's part of the appeal of Trump. But I do believe that if you were to ask most Republicans and most Americans, do you think that divisiveness is a good thing? Do you think it's a good thing to set one group against another? Most people would say, no, that's not a good thing, and we have to keep the country together.
In your op-ed, you said he is the most divisive president in our history. There hasn't been a more divisive person in national politics since George Wallace. And of course, George Wallace ran for president in 1968 basically as a segregationist. So that's as strong a condemnation as I've heard of any American politician since George Wallace.
Well, it's meant to be very strong, and I think it's important for my party. I'm a Republican, and I'm happy to be a Republican. But I think we have to make it clear that we are not like Donald Trump. But I also want to add this, Lawrence. I think that, there's a lot of blame to be placed on Trump for the divisiveness in this country, but it's a more general problem than just one person, than just Donald Trump. And the responsibility is shared by a lot of people. It's shared by Democrats. It's shared by people who practice identity politics. It's shared by all of us when we're very touchy and complain about microaggressions and so on. I mean, there are a lot of components that go into the splintering of America that's now too bad. And I think that all of us have a responsibility. But in this op-ed, I was writing as a Republican to my party and saying that we have to get back to our roots, namely the history, the tradition of Abraham Lincoln, the tradition of keeping this as one nation indivisible.
What did you hear from congressional Republicans about your op-ed piece?
Oh, I haven't heard anything. I haven't solicited their views, and I haven't heard their views. I've had, obviously, a lot of feedback in a lot of ways from many people, some of whom are Republicans, some of whom are not Republicans. But as far as people in elective office, I haven't heard anything.
But wouldn't that be disappointing, Senator, if what your hope is to reclaim the Republican Party and be saying we have to make it clear that Donald Trump is not us? Wouldn't you like to have heard from some of your former colleagues in the Senate about that op-ed piece and said, at least privately say to you, you're right about this, we've got to figure out how to get this back?
Well, as far as people now active in politics, I think it's difficult for them. I mean, most people in politics want to win the next election, and to say that, a substantial part of your base consists of people who are very strongly for Trump. It's very difficult, I think, for people who are now active in elective politics. But for people who have some distance from it, people like me who don't intend to run again, is our voice as persuasive as those in elective politics today? No, it isn't. But I think that's the most likely source for Republicans to speak out, and it's very important for us to speak out.
Former Senator John Danforth, thank you very much for joining us tonight, Senator.
Thank you.
Tonight's last word is next.
Breaking news, President Trump not backing down from his controversial pardon of the former Sheriff Joe Arpaio. Arpaio, of course, arrested people suspected of being in the United States illegally, using racial profiling even after a judge said he could not. Here's the president today.
Sheriff Joe is a patriot. Sheriff Joe loves our country. Sheriff Joe protected our borders. And Sheriff Joe was very unfairly treated by the Obama administration. I stand by my pardon of Sheriff Joe, and I think the people of Arizona who really know him best would agree with me.
Sarah Murray is out front at the White House. And Sarah, obviously, this is a very controversial pardon. You've got Democrats and Republicans saying it was the wrong thing to do. The president, though, clearly defiant.
Well, that's right. Despite that blowback, the president made very clear today that he has no regrets about pardoning a very controversial individual and so early in his term. And he was asked about the timing of this. He decided, or rather the White House decided to announce this pardon as Hurricane Harvey, this Category 4 hurricane, was bearing down on Texas. But today, the president insisted in no way was he trying to bury the news. Listen to what he said.
Well, a lot of people think it was the right thing to do, John. And actually, in the middle of a hurricane, even though it was a Friday evening, I assumed the ratings would be far higher than they would be normally. You know, the hurricane was just starting. And I put it out that I had pardoned, as we say, Sheriff Joe. He's done a great job for the people of Arizona.
So you see him making a pretty incredible argument there that, in fact, the pardon may have gotten even more attention because it came amid the storm, and it maybe ratings were even higher than they would have been on a Friday night. But, Aaron, I can tell you that as we were talking to White House aides on Friday night, as we were wading through this news, none of them disputed the notion that this was part of a news dump.
All right. Thank you very much, Sarah. And out front now, a man who was pulled over with his wife by one of Arpaio's deputies, even though he's been a U.S. citizen for decades, Daniel Magos. His testimony helped convict Arpaio in a class action lawsuit about racial profiling. And Daniel, I appreciate your taking the time. I know you just heard the president there, right, saying Sheriff Joe's a patriot. He loves our country. He protected our borders. And that the people of Arizona, who know Joe Arpaio best, would agree with this pardon. Do you?
No, I don't. He was not enforcing Arizona or Maricopa County laws or statutes. He was trying to enforce federal laws of immigration and crossing the border without documents.
And I know, Daniel, you were pulled over with your wife. You were out together driving by one of Arpaio's deputies. So when this question comes up of racial profiling, tell me what happened to you.
I was driving to a job site, and one of Arpaio's deputies was coming the opposite direction. I was waiting for a left turn signal to come on so that I could turn to the left. And then the deputy came across the intersection, slowed down to almost zero, focused his eyes on my wife and I, staring at both of us. And then he accelerated at a high rate speed, made a U-turn, and turned his signals on, his lights on, and his siren, and came after us.
And he asked you a lot of questions that made it clear it was racial profiling to you, right?
Yes, correct.
What did he ask?
I had asked, well, he asked me for my documents, driver's license, registration, insurance on my truck, but then he demanded my wife's driver's license. And I told him my wife was not the driver, I was. And during the whole traffic stop, he was never talking to me or my wife in a decent tone of voice. He was always yelling at us, and his right hand always on top of his gun, intimidating us. And he did intimidate my wife, but not me.
Now, I know that this obviously happened to you and to your wife, and I know that this had a lot of an impact on her. Sheriff Arpaio went on Fox News just after the pardon, and he reacted to it. I wanted to play for you, Daniel, a clip of what he said.
Well, it's great. I love that president. He supports law enforcement, and I'm very humble. After all these years, 55 years in law enforcement around the world, and here I am on the defense table because they wanted to do everything to get rid of me, certain people.
Sheriff Arpaio says he's the victim here. What is your response to that? What happened to you and your wife after this stop?
After the stop, we went to the American Civil Liberties Union and filed a complaint, because I tried to file a complaint with the Sheriff's Department, and they would say, we'll return your call, and they never did. 3 occasions I called, and they never returned the call. My son-in-law called another 3 or 4 times. They told him, we'll return the call, and they never did. So that was the reason that I went to American Civil Liberties Union, and they took the case and put me in the racial profiling file lawsuit that they had filed against Sheriff Joe and Maricopa County Sheriff's Office.
All right. Well, Daniel, I appreciate your taking the time and telling us your story again. Thank you, Daniel Magos. And out front now, David Gergen, April Ryan, White House correspondent for American Urban Radio Networks, and Doug Brinkley, presidential historian. David, you just heard Daniel Magos, his story. Donald Trump, though, President Trump is very proud of this pardon. Will it help him or hurt him when it comes to voters?
Well, it will help in the short term to reinforce his base. That's clearly why he did it, although we have this bizarre story. We all thought he was trying to hide the announcement and the storm, and instead he made the announcement because of the storm. But I must tell you, Aaron, in terms of the long-term politics of the United States, with the Latino vote growing ever more important in so many states, this sends a message from Trump and increasingly from the Republican Party that if you're Latino, you're not welcome in our party. And it just seems to me, I'm incredulous that this isn't part of Republican sort of understanding now. After what happened in California, there was an incident in California, of course, on Proposition 187 some years ago. It was seen as anti-Latino, and California has been a Democratic state ever since. So I think that long term, just politically, but it's the more important thing about this is the morality and the values it states. But it does have political repercussions.
It may, but Doug, I guess the question I have for you is, does every president do something like this? I mean, the president was ready, for the question of why are you doing this? In fact, he read a list of controversial pardons by other presidents. Here's President Trump.
President Clinton pardoned Susan Rosenberg, a member of the weathered underground, charged as part of a bank robbery that led to a guard and 2 police officers being killed. President Obama commuted the sentence of Oscar Lopez Rivera, who was charged as part of a violent independence group from Puerto Rico responsible for 28 Chicago area bombings and many deaths.
How does Arpaio compare, Doug?
Well, look, incredulous is the right word that David Gergen just used, that Donald Trump is disuniting America. And the fact that he pardoned somebody who is seen as a race baiter, anti-Latino, somebody who is, really the kingpin of racial profiling, and he pardons him in the middle of a catastrophic Category 4 storm slamming into the Texas coast.